virtual seminar. So I'm Shaoli Nan. I'm the director of the Center for Health and Risk Communication at Maryland. So we host, this is our CHRC virtual seminars series, and we do this 4 times a year, 2 in the fall and 2 in the spring. And we feature both the leading and emerging scholars in risk communication, broadly defined. So risk communication encompassing like health, risk, and science, and environment. So pretty much like the come share stuff we're trying to feature here. So before I introduce our awesome speaker today, just a brief logistics. So just so you know, we're recording this, and so we can share this later on our YouTube channel. So others who cannot attend today will get to watch this later. So if you don't feel like being on the camera, you can turn off your camera. But I think we're all appreciated if you make your presence known to all of us. And so John will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and they will have some time at the end for Q&A, which is about 10 to 15 minutes. Now, you can ask questions. You can save your questions at the end to ask John directly. Or during the talk, if you have questions, you can always type in your question into the chat. We're going to pick up those questions at the end. Okay, so now I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. John Besley. Now, John is the Alice Brandt Professor of Public Relations at Michigan State University. John is really among the most cited and published science communication and public engagement scholars in the world, with more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and other reports, and as well as funding from governmental agencies, including NSF, USDA, and foundation sources. He earned his PhD from Cornell and is the associate editor for the risk communication section for the journal Risk Analysis, which we know is a leading journal in this area. And he is on the editorial boards of Science Communication, Environmental Communication, Public Understanding of Science, Journal Science Communication, and the Journal of Risk Research. Now today, John's going to share some key ideas from his recently published book called Strategic Science Communication, published by Johns Hopkins University in 2022 with co-author Anthony Doodle. The presentation will draw on John's extensive research into understanding how scientists think about science communication, as well as efforts to outline how social science theory might be used to help scientists think more strategically about their communication choices. So this work involves surveys of more than 30,000 scientists, interviews with more than 150 scientists and other actors from across the scientific community, and participation in a wide range of projects aimed at improving science communication training and strategic thinking. So while I read this, I get really excited about it. So we can wait to hear more about it from Dr. Besley. So now I give you Dr. Besley, who will be talking about making science communication more strategic. So take it over.
Thank you. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. And thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you to the folks who are putting into chat, giving me some background on who's actually here, which is super helpful to this. I'm going to largely take this from the perspective of, I think a lot of you are going to be communication scholars, people studying communication. There may be, I understand there's some undergrads and grad students, and there's sort of the whole range. I'm going to take it sort of from a perspective of, we're doing a pretty broad talk. Happy to dive in when people have specific questions. I'll have the chat. If I look over here, it's because I'm looking at the chat, though I can only do that so much while I talk.
I can monitor the chat for you.
Perfect. Yes, that would be great. And yeah, and so I'm going to talk about this book that Anthony and I published last year. It's a funny thing where we've been giving a version of this talk for a couple of years, and then you're like, we should write a book from the talk, and then you talk about the book. Then you write the book, and then you talk about the book some more, the talk some more. And so but it's evolved a lot over the years. If you go back and look how we originally talked about this stuff, it's definitely changed a bunch over the years. And so I'll essentially what I'll do is walk through the argument we're making in the book. I won't do a lot of data. I'll almost do no data, in fact, and it'll really just be the arguments about really what the argument we're trying to make. And I will, so let's just do a quick, there's a slide here, that's my background. I think a lot of these were picked up. I'm Canadian, moved south, then I moved north, on lots of really, the most important thing to me is probably that last line, and maybe the journal things, because I'm really trying very hard, especially in the last 10 years, to be somewhat of an engaged scholar, which is to say a person I'm trying to be part of the science communication practitioner community, as well as part of the science communication researcher community. And I think of that including environmental communication, risk communication. Health communication, of course, is a bit of its own thing, but I still feel like I have some connections into that space. But yeah, and so it's been a few years we've been doing this. I'm going to start by talking about my goals, and I start with a vision goal, which is ultimately what my work is about. Is I want to increase, and you guys, you guys are in the way of my slides, so I actually can't see what I'm supposed to say. I can see you guys, but not my slides. So ultimately, my vision, my goal, my big goal, ultimate goal is I want people to turn to science. I'm fine saying that. I'm an applied researcher. I'm good with being an applied researcher. I work with the scientific community. I want to help people turn to science when they face challenging questions. I'm going to use turn to as a thing that people do. That's like a physical thing, which I'm going to start talking about as goals when there's this physical behavioral kind of thing. And yeah, and so that's what I ultimately want. That's kind of big. I also have goals whenever I'm talking about this stuff for like the individual talks I'm doing. Generally, when I'm talking to scientists, my goal is with this book, with a lot of talks I give related to the book, there's this differentiation that I think that we don't make enough, and that I know from talking to people in the scientific community isn't done as well as I would love, which is that this differentiation between audience-specific behavioral goals, cognitive and affective communication objectives, and tactics. And my worry is sometimes is that we mix those things together and sort of we say goals or objectives, and those particular, like if you call it a goal or objective, doesn't matter. But the thing that really matters is going to be that behavioral bit and that cognitive affective bit. And we're going to get into that quite a bit in a second. Also, just as a point around goals, I always have goals. I have things I want people to do. As a result of my research, as a result of my sharing some of our thinking. One of the things about being an ethical communicator that I'll argue as we go through here is that I also have goals for myself, which is I want to do better research. I want to hear things from you guys. I want to think about the research I'm doing in smarter ways. Maybe I tackle different questions. Maybe I tackle the questions I'm tackling in different ways, but I'm always trying to change. When I communicate, I always have a goal of changing my own behavior. And that's also going to be an important thing we're going to return to in a second. Now, you guys are a bit of a different audience than I often talk to. Oddly, I increasingly talk to people who aren't communication scholars, but I am going to push you guys. I'm going to push, but particularly those of you who are communication scholars, to push this distinction too. That I think this distinction is in our theories, but I know when we talk about science communication, when I hear people talking about science communication, we're a little loose with this difference between behaviors and goals. Between behavior, goal type outcomes, and cognitive and affective type outcomes. And yeah, and so underlying this, we've been doing lots of, if you look in our Google Scholar, my Google Scholar, you'll see we've done tons of surveys of scientists now. We almost always have a new scientist survey in the field of some kind. We just finished 2 different ones, one with survey scientists at long-term ecological research sites, another one with basic scientists. The Kavli Foundation funded. We've been doing NSF funded some surveys. We've just done a lot of surveys. We also do a lot of interview work, interviews with trainers. We've done that a couple times, foundations, fellowship programs, philanthropies, a lot of interviews with scientists. All of that sort of underlies this. And ultimately, there's these sort of 4 things that I always worry I'm whining, but 4 things that I see happening in science communication that we're sort of speaking to here. One is, I think there's a lot of people who still think of science communication as communicating science, and I'm going to really push back on that. I talk about science communication as communication in the context of science. I don't love it when we talk about science communication as communicating scientific research, and we do that all the time. And it seems like a minor thing, but I'm going to argue it's actually a bigger thing. I also underlying that is this idea that when we talk about a lot of the training programs that are out there, we know this from my interviews with trainers, we know this from talking to scientists about what they've heard when they've worked with practitioners, is good communication means it's clear and it doesn't have jargon. Maybe it's vivid. There's some emotionalness to it. Maybe there's stories, but that's what good communication is. And I think for those of us who are communication scholars, I'm going to argue that those are tactical level things. Those aren't what constitute, those might make for good communication, but that's essentially at the level. People in this space really aren't thinking, for the most part, and this is the practitioners, the scientists aren't thinking right now at a level of that we would think about when we think about our theories of behavior change. Looking at some of your introductions, some of you mentioned, being involved in persuasion research or in behavior change research. And the last thing, the last two things is, one, there's a lot of this discussion that I'm going to emphasize. I'm not sure how it fits in entirely, but so when we talk to science communication people, they often think of science communication as being a thing that individual scientists do. We train individual scientists. We give awards for individual communicators. You guys are Maryland. You guys are from the home of public relations. I mean, like public relations scholarship. You guys know that communication is this collaborative thing. It's a thing that if we want to do it well, we do it. We find shared goals, and so there's just not a lot of that discussion in the science communication space. And that's actually something in our current work we're really trying to figure out how to move away from this individual focused science communication. And that related to that is really this focus on tactics that I'm gonna spend a lot of time talking about. And ultimately, an argument I'm gonna make to you guys is that for when our book is based on really 4 bodies of theory, so the 2, 3, and 4 are really these integrative theories that are actually bring together a whole bunch of other theories that, so different names, but similar concepts. But when I work with scientists, these are the sort of the 4 bodies of theory that I really emphasize, that we really put into the book. And I'm just going to talk about why these 4 things are so important to me. 5 and 6 are super important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. I have some issues with some ethics around the emotions bit for science communication where it might be fun to talk about. And then the framing one, it sort of brings everything back in, and it's just a little, we don't have time to talk about everything. And so I'll start with those 4. The first theory that was on that list, the thing that this concept where we really made that we starting to people throw around the word strategic. They talk about, the importance of strategy, but I don't think that we're not as always careful as what we mean. What I mean, I take this from this sort of classic article by Han. I really mean, and we've sort of expanded it out a little bit, but I really mean audience-specific behavioral goals, like I said, cognitive and affective objectives, and communication tactics. And then a strategy means you have goals, you figure out what cognitive and affective objectives you might want to achieve those goals, and only then do we start thinking about what tactics we might do. And that's what I mean by it. A strategy is the whole thing. It's not a social media strategy. Your strategy might involve social media, but it's weird to say social media strategy to me. It kind of bugs me when people do it. Or when we're like, we have a dialogue strategy. Well, dialogue might be part of your strategy, but it's not a dialogue. It's just, we need goals, we need objectives to really talk about strategy. And when we wrote our book and we called it Strategic Science Communication, we almost called it, I don't know if we almost did. We've thought about calling it intentional science communication to really emphasize the intentionality bit, the choices bit. And so, which is also true, we're really into that part, but we ultimately use the language of strategy. And it's a thing I wanted, if anybody wants to, we wanted to get like a working group of communication scholars to go and read. I've spent a bunch of time reading like classic business strategy and military strategy books. And I just like the language of strategy. I like this differentiation between the things we want to happen in the real world and then, the things that might make that happen, and particularly in the communication strategy space. Ultimately, behavioral goals means having impact, not just having an impact, but good strategy might be efficient impact. We don't, especially in the science communication space, all these communication spaces, there aren't infinite resources. So we really need to think about that. And again, this idea of so much of our discussion in science communication is about how can we avoid use jargon, which is a tactic, this tactical focus. That nice thing about strategy is it specifically says, stop focusing on tactics. At first, and when we get to tactics, you have to do tactics, but that we shouldn't focus there. And so I love the language of strategy, and I just think it's a fun, I don't know. It's good. I like it. I really, and related to this in this PR space, I increasingly, and I recognize I'm a bit of a weird person to be an Ellison Brandt chair in public relations. I'm not really traditionally a public relations scholar. Spend a lot of time taking students to New York and Chicago, visiting PR shops. I don't use a lot of PR theory, but one body of theory that I am really coming back to in some current work is this idea of excellence, and this idea of, I particularly like this idea of the strategist versus the tactician. I think that's such an important distinction that we're spending more time thinking about now. I also like the language of social science, though. I'm ultimately a social scientist. There's some weird stuff in the PR literature about thinking that, it's not just, there's a social science of public relations, but I really like the social science part of this. And the reason I really like the social science bit for what I'm doing is that I like the concept. I love talking about concepts. Theories are great. I actually spend more of my time thinking about concepts. One of the annoying things in social science theory is there's like, I studied, one of my main areas of research is trust and trustworthiness. And there's just all these different words. People use all kinds of different words to really mean the same thing. And it drives me a little bit bonkers, and it makes it really hard for science communicators, for professional communicators to get into the literature, because maybe they think that credibility is different than trust. And if you really look at how things are measured, maybe they're not. And I really don't think they're not. And so I love Top Chef, the show. And so I just think of this idea of sophistication as like, if you're a sophisticated communicator, you know your ingredients. You can put a blindfold on and you still know when somebody's talking about integrity versus benevolence, and that those are, we can call it warmth or competence, we can call it, or that would be goodwill versus trustworthiness, but we know the ingredients no matter what you call them. To me, there's this interesting idea of sophistication that I've been trying to figure out how to make a measure for, but that's ultimately what we want. And so, yeah, and so I'm going to be a little bit fussy about some of our I'm going to push some terms and push some definitions, and I don't know if they're quite typologies yet, but when we talk about in the book about behavioral goals, one of the things we're really careful to do is to always mean audience specific behavioral goals. And I'm trying to get myself to say audience specific behavioral goals. And there's an easy version of that, which is like all the behaviors that we think: buy an electric vehicle, vote for a specific person, donate to a specific person. That's an easy sort of version of goals. Now, it's tricky in the science comm space. There are people who will tell you that no, scientists are uncomfortable having goals. I'm going to argue that's not true in a second, but sometimes they're okay with. We've done a little experiment, one of our recent things. If you, instead of saying, what's your goal, like what do you want people to do, if you say, what do you want people to consider doing in the context of your science, then it's okay. And so but it's still a goal. It's still a behavior underlying your communication. Now, so that's easy. And so one of the things we're always trying to push scientists to, like, well, what do you actually want to happen? Now, there's a tricky one here, which is, I study trust, and there's also a version of trust. And so when I always think of this in terms of my science communication work, let's say I'm working with genetically modified food, GMO, ag biotech researchers, people who do GM food, and they think, oh, I need people, or nuclear energy. We want people to support us. Like, they think there's a behavior, but there's actually, what they want is people not to oppose them, right? Which is a different kind of behavior. They need people to not do a thing, not protest, to not get in the way, to accept a decision as legitimate, which is a different thing. It's a behavior, but it's a trust behavior. We think of the trustworthiness literature, we differentiate, which I'll argue with, trustworthiness perceptions, beliefs, from the behaviors. The behavior is that willingness to make yourself vulnerable. And so I really am always pushing scientists, like, what is your actual goal? And I have a slide about that in a second on what that conversation looks like. Now, another important part when I'm working with scientists, though, and the thing that we don't do as well in the book as I think we should have, is recognizing that it's too easy to talk about behavioral goals for science communication as being like, I want other people to do things. And remember, when I introduced my goals, I had a goal for myself. And so one of the things we really work with scientists on is like, well, what do you want to change? Like, how do you want to go into a communication opportunity? And so we talk about two-way dialogue in a general sort of generic way in science communication, health communication, environmental communication, but we don't really like just dialogue. So often we're talking about dialogue for the sake of dialogue. And so my version of real two-way dialogue is, I have a goal. Maybe I have a sort of a tentative goal, a thing I want you to consider. But I also, if I'm serious about two-way dialogue, I'm trying to figure out, should I do my research differently? Or maybe I just need to communicate differently or something, but I have the goals that I want to do for myself. I'm trying to figure out who I can trust. I'm trying to figure out what I can do differently. But yeah, so really that's what I mean when I talk about goals. So I said scientists have goals. They absolutely have goals. We pushed scientists on this. This is probably our most recent thing, supported by the foundation. Almost always we get some version of increased likelihood that people consider scientific evidence as the number one goal. If we actually, in this case, we didn't attach, we separated the audience from the behavior, but the number one audience was almost always policymakers. And scientists want policymakers to consider evidence when they make decisions. That's what they want. Sometimes they want youth to consider careers. Sometimes we're trying to talk about, like, they want to build trust broadly in science or with specific groups. But key idea, and if you go, this isn't published yet, but we have a version of this, another version of this, slightly different, that is, scientists have behavior-like goals. It's not just, they don't just want to make people happy. Oh, what did I do there? Yeah, and we also have, so one of the, I actually won't talk about it, but in my research, and like in our research, if you look into our papers, we also know we do lots of research about what makes it more likely that scientists are going to choose goals or objectives or tactics. And I'll actually come back to that at the end a little bit. There's challenges in talking to scientists about goals. One of the ones is this vision versus goal thing. Like, yeah, there's like my big vision. I want robust funding for science, but then I got like the fun thing of strategy, right? It's like, well, all right, what does that mean for a whole bunch of different audiences? What specific groups? And so that's a really fun conversation to have with scientists or to have with science communicators that I don't think we do enough of this talking about, well, let's break down our big vision goal into all these, like, well, I need these people to do this and these people to do that, and this other group to do this thing. And actually this group needs to do this and then this and then this. And we have these like stages of change models, excuse me. Stages of change models, which I really like, where we think about this sort of progression thing, but I don't think we spend enough time in the SciComm literature or in the SciComm discussions with practitioners talking about, well, yeah, it's not, we don't have one behavioral goal. We have a sort of a series of behavioral goals. And what we really need is some way to parse those out. I also think one of the really other big challenges in this space is when I'm working with scientists is that I love thinking about is the specificity of the goal. And so like sometimes there's like we're working right now with some astrophysicists. And so they have some specific goals, like they want specific kids from specific neighborhoods to consider science careers. So that's a nice specific goal. Now, they also have like, they broadly want people to turn to science, the sort of broad societal trust, right? And so they're like there's different goals. And so it is, I mean, applied researchers, I work with like long-term ecological research sites, and then maybe they want a group of legislators to enact a specific policy around pests, around invasive pests. So that's like a nice specific thing. Now, once we know that that's our goal, now we can really have fun building out strategy. And we'll talk about what that strategy looks like in the terms of objectives and tactics. But when we get it now, but it's a little bit harder sometimes for when you're an applied researcher to come up with goals. And actually this is really important concept too, this idea of like, can I come up with goals that directly affect the impact of my research versus are my engagement goals, my communication goals, are they ancillary to my research? Are they sort of beyond my research? And if they're a little bit outside my research, we really do get into these questions of like, should you get credit for that on your tenure and promotion package, for example, right? Like it's easy for me to justify, like if I do, well, for me, like to some extent, this is engagement for me. I'm trying to like, or if I'm working with scientists, that's outreach, that's engagement, and so I can, when I go my annual review, my chair is happy about, one of the nice things about MSU is we really value that. And so I get credit for all the work I do trying to help scientists think about communication more effectively. Now, if I was just doing stuff that helped youth consider careers in PR, that's a little bit of a harder sell in terms of grading credit for it. But there is something really important here about like the specificity of your goal and these broader discussions in the science comm space about credit for engagement. Also, there's this interesting, fun discussion about where these goals come from. One of the things we're really excited that we think is kind of interesting is this idea of asset mapping. We've realized when we go into, so one, your goals should come from your individual interests, but also hopefully, remember I talked about the importance of like, not just going at an individual level communication. Hopefully you have goals that you share with colleagues that you can, whether it's in your long-term ecological research site or in a lab you're part of or something. But there's this other thing, which is this asset bit. And I don't want to talk about that too much, except there's a really neat thing about thinking more about, that's not in the book at all, but we're starting to think about, like, it's not just that if I'm a astrophysicist working in a specific community, like I can't just choose any goal. I mean, I could just choose any goal I want, but one of the things that's going to help me choose my goals is like, well, what opportunities do I have? And so what audiences do I have access to? What technology, what reason, like maybe I have access to a big telescope. Maybe I have access to specific groups of schools, and that assets part is going to be, and I don't know, we don't talk about it too much in the communication space. We're trying to figure out how to talk about it. But there is an interesting, fun discussion in this goals thing about where goals should come from. And ultimately what it comes down to is this conversation that I have all the time. This is my probably number one conversation I have with scientists, and I suspect other people have had it, and I hope other people are having it, and I want you to have it, because one of the things we found when we're talking to science communication trainers, for example, is that we'll say, well, how do you, when the scientists that you're training, how do they pick their goals? And like, well, they come to us with their goals. And I get really worried about that, because I know when scientists come to me with their goals, that I have to say, okay, you want to decrease misinformation? Like, but why? Like, that's a nice thing to say. It sounds good off the sort of as a starting point, but I need to say, like, well, what do you hope will happen if you decrease misinformation? And then we can get into, well, what type of misinformation and like, but really the fundamental thing is what thing, and then we can talk about, well, would decreasing misinformation of a specific type actually lead to the behavior you want? If we don't know the behavior we want, you have a hypothesis that there's some piece of information that people have that's causing a problem. The real thing you care about, presumably, is the behavior you care about, not the misinformation. The misinformation is easy because it's the thing you see, it's available to it. It's right up front. And so we get focused on the misinformation. But the job of the strategist, we would argue, is to look past that and say, no, why are you worried about misinformation? What behavior are you worried about? And it may be that correcting some specific piece of information is what's needed, but it might be that we need to actually come around it from a different angle, and that's where a really good strategy comes from. And I worry we don't do that enough, that we don't push, people aren't pushing scientists. And I actually think more broadly, this is true across the communication space. I know in talking to public relations people and our students and some of our, people that, we go back to this idea of the communication professional strategist being a top level manager, part of a corporate suite. Part of the reason for that is you need communication people who are willing to really push back on the people with power and say, that's a silly goal. That's not a real goal. What's your real goal? And that having those conversations, and that conversation is not happening as far as I can tell, or I shouldn't say is not happening, is rarely happening in the science communication space. But I also think more broadly, it's not happening in most communication spaces because, communication people lack power, lack expertise, lack something. And so, so I really want us to push that things. And so there's some of the warning signs we sort of like, when I hear scientists say some of these things, my goal is to increase awareness. Well, why do you want to increase awareness? Improve literacy. Why do you want to improve literacy? Correct misinformation, improve attitudes, all these things. A lot of these are what I would call objectives. They're sort of like warning signs to me, red flags that we're not having a real discussion around strategy. We're jumping right to sort of hypotheses, and that we need to broaden out the conversation. And I want us as a community to push those conversations. I was worried, like, oh, of course we're going to push those conversations, but I also know from interacting with folks that people aren't pushing people beyond. I had a grad student in here yesterday, like, oh, awareness, increase awareness. Like, no, we're not doing like, why do you want to do awareness? It's easy to fall into these sort of non-goals. It's also easy to fall into having goals that are only about changing other people and not having goals about oneself. And then there's the tactic stuff. I'm not going to talk about tactics too much. We've sort of we break down tactics in the book into like, how do you behave? How do you set up the room? How do you dress? How do you stand? All these like behavioral communication things that are important. It's not one of the things we know is that everybody wants to talk about messages. And of course, messages aren't the only way we communicate. And so we need to make sure we're always pushing that home. Public relations is great because they know that better than a lot of areas of communication. I love my former PhD student, Shupei Yuan's work on communication style, particularly aggressive styles. We need to get scientists to not be so aggressive sometimes. And then channel. Everybody likes to talk about jump right to channels. What channel should we use to communicate? Well, it depends on what your goal is and what objectives would help you achieve your goals. And so I'm not going to, and we know most of the training is in the books, like a lot of the most popular science comm stuff is definitely in this tactical space. And there's always oops, that's weird ordering. There's always this danger that people are going to conflate these tactics with strategy. I've mentioned that already. Oh, actually, the one storytelling is probably the one. Storytelling strategy. It's not a strategy, it's a tactic. Dialogue. So many things that we want to talk about are tactical choices that we can do, but they're not strategies and they're not goals unto themselves. And so ultimately the book is really about, and we're halfway in here, the book is really not about goals and behaviors. The book is structured around what we talk cognitive and affective objectives, that big middle thing in there. That's what the book is really about. Most of the chapters are in the book. There is this one other area of theory that before we get to that I want to emphasize that I think makes us a little bit different. And I'm actually really curious how people feel about us doing this. We really actively do not think in terms of what we might call fast communication, if going from the Kahneman book, nudges, cognitive shortcuts. That sometimes makes a lot of sense when we're doing like health communication campaigns type of stuff. I'm really feel a little bit weird about asking most of the scientists I work with to try to use these sort of heuristic cues to communicate. The types of communication that we're really interested in the book are what we think of as slow communication, communication that works through that systematic central root processes, where we're actually trying to change evaluative beliefs, where we're like cumulative, long-term, we're gradually trying to get you to believe certain things. And I'll talk about what beliefs in a second, but it's that part that we're really interested in the book. I do not train scientists. There may be places for it, but I don't get involved in training scientists, particularly to rely heavily on heuristic cues, though I know how important they are, which is also why I don't talk about emotions too much here. No, everything we talk about we'll talk about is evaluative beliefs, because they have this affective bit built into the beliefs. And so, yeah, so these are the things I'll talk about these just briefly. You guys know them. I mean, underlying this, so the second chapter of the book is really about this classic problem in science communication. We try to reconceptualize the, so there's this whole idea like deficit model thinking in science communication, which I think gets overused. We try to conceptualize that as an over-reliance on a single communication objective. You are absolutely going to share your science when you communicate in the context of science. That's why people invite you into the room. That's why people ask scientists to show up in Congress. People want to hear scientists, social scientists research. And so this idea that that deficit model thinking means like I'm going to share, somehow sharing science is bad, is a problem. Of course, we're always going to share science. The challenge is it's not the only objective. It's just one of many objectives that we can do, is how we like to think of this thing. And so, this idea of we're not communicating science, we're communicating in the context of science, which might include communicating science, but doesn't just mean communicating science. So what else might we communicate? I'm a trust researcher. I want to be a trust researcher. I wish I got into this whole space because I was trying to figure out how to get scientists to use the research that I was doing on procedural justice and fairness and trust. And so what beyond sharing scientific facts, what else could I share? I could share information that might affect people's beliefs about other people, particularly beliefs about scientists. And so this is the most common model. It's not one that communication researchers use. Communication researchers, for whatever reason, like to turn to McCroskey and his distinction between goodwill and trustworthiness and competence. I don't actually like that model because I don't like the word trustworthiness, because if you ask somebody what does it mean to be trustworthy, they might say competent. And so I actually prefer, I like this is much more heavily cited broader theory from organizational theory, organizational psychology, that is ABI model, which is ability, benevolence, integrity. Exact same concepts though. Let's actually just pop it into this view, which is a little easier to look at. So when I talk to scientists, one of the things I really emphasize them doing is so what might you communicate beyond your science, what you found in your research, or what people in your area found? What are you doing, given that if your goal is behavioral trust, if you want people to turn to you, what are you doing to communicate that you maybe, so expertise is tricky because people generally already believe scientists have expertise, so I don't worry too much about that one. But what are you doing? If we look at surveys of scientists, we can see that people aren't worried about expertise. They are worried about what are scientists' motives. Are they trying to help people? Are they corrupted by funding sources, which is benevolence and integrity? My favorite body of literature, which isn't in that ABI model, that integrative model, is procedural justice literature, which talks about willingness to listen or voice. And so do people feel like scientists are open and willing to listen? It's a sort of a separate thing. I mean, it's related. Obviously, integrity beliefs and warmth beliefs or benevolence beliefs and willingness to listen beliefs are super highly correlated, but they're conceptually different things. And those are things that we can communicate. If we make choice, if we decide that we want trust, I can't communicate, trust me. I can communicate, here's why you should see me as caring. Here's why you should see me as honest. Here's why you should see me as willing to listen. Here's the behaviors that I'm doing. Here's how I can behave in ways that demonstrate caring and integrity and benevolence. So we spend a lot of time when I'm working with scientists, like, well, could we put this into your bio? Could we put this into in your talk, if you have 60 minutes, if you have 600 words, what are you saying about your motives? Don't just jump right to your science. What are you saying about why you're doing the science? What are you saying about what you did to make sure you're listening to audiences before you do your science? I spend a lot of time trying to get scientists to insert that content and maybe pull back a little bit on the science bits. Love the other really fun thing about these types of beliefs is people are always asking me, how should we evaluate science communication? We do most of our science communication evaluation is, do people enjoy it? Do people feel more self-efficacious? Which is fine, but we can do research like, did people see this speaker as caring and honest and knowledgeable? Those are things we can do after every talk. Those are things we can do Coca-Cola is collecting data every year on how people perceive Coca-Cola in all kinds of ways in all kinds of places. We don't know enough about how people perceive various scientists, but these are things that we could know about scientists in general or specific groups of scientists in specific contexts. And so we need to push scientists to think, and the book is really pushing scientists to think about these as potential things that they could communicate to if they have a goal, that's a trust-related goal. And frankly, everybody has a trust-related goal. Everybody in science wants to be trusted. So see, these are almost always things that scientists need to be attending to. Similarly, theory of planned behavior is probably more common. I like the integrated model of I like the integrated model of behavioral prediction, or the IBM, which is an extension of that, brings in, sort of tries to pull in, health belief models, all protection motivation theory, all the different models of behavior change. Generally speaking, most of the variables come down to these like risk benefit beliefs, affective or instrumental. Let's make an easier version of that to see. These types of beliefs. These are all, so there is like Compass Science Communication Training spends a lot of time trying to teach scientists how to communicate the benefits of research, which is great. We should absolutely communicate the benefits of research, but what we really care about, if we're being a strategic communication, is the benefits of a specific behavior that we're advocating, right? And so we need to be like more careful, and we need to push scientists and communicators to be more careful about, it's not just communicating the benefits of science, it's communicating the benefits of a behavior that you want. And it could be instrumental benefits. It's going to be useful. It could be satisfaction benefits. It's going to be enjoyable or satisfying. Yeah, and so those are things that scientists, we could get better at communicating. Almost nobody, when I ask scientists about like, well, what are some things you could communicate, other types of things beyond information about your science you can communicate, nobody is in the science communication space is really thinking about communicating norms. Don't know why. We, of course, in science, in health, and we talk about norms all the time. It is not a concept that seems to have gotten out there very much. And so we can talk to scientists, like maybe you want to talk about what other people think. The consensus literature is kind of related to this. The whole Sandra van der Linden work around communicating scientific consensus. It's kind of in this space. It's a little different, but kind of in the space. So it's starting to maybe appear a little bit, but that's about what do others trying to communicate. Here's what scientists think versus here's what your friends think. Here's what people close to you think. And so we have a whole chapter just on like, maybe you want to communicate something about norms. And then of course, self-efficacy beliefs. People it's not enough to communicate that you can do a thing, that a thing is beneficial. We need to get scientists. And again, if we don't push scientists, if we don't push science communicators, most people in this space are, and I think we all know this stuff. These are like our basic pantries. This is chicken and rice and flour. I mean, these are our basic pantry ingredients, but it's really hard to get scientists to think about these things. And the science communication space isn't thinking about these things. And so we have chapters on each of these sort of core concepts, each of the colors, trying to get the science communicators to think about these as potential objectives beyond just. And so you put that together, you get this sort of like, well, that's what you get, this sort of again, this is that did I do a picture? Sometimes I do a picture of a pantry. I didn't do a picture of a pantry here, but so I do think of this as like sort of the pantry of like ingredients that go into good communication strategy. Fun meta bit for those of us who are communication researchers. This is also how we study science communication choices. So for me, if I want a scientist to choose to put more money, this is a project we're doing now. If I want scientists to put more money into science communication activities, that's a behavior. Put more money into science communication. That means they need to believe that putting more money into science communication is beneficial, normative, and within their power. They need to trust that the people that they're putting money into are caring and competent and honest. And so there's a meta bit to this. It's like, these to me are the ingredients of how to get in these sort of cumulative things about how to get people to do behaviors. And so we're trying to get science communicators to think more about these potential objectives, but we're also using it to study scientists' choice about goals and objectives and tactics. Yeah, and then I'm just finish up saying like, it's just there's so much of our conversations in this space are super vague, and if we could get better at this focus on identify a goal, identify objectives, and then we can have really fun conversations about tactics. Yeah, we can do that. In this case, this is a version of that, an example of that for, let's not just build trust, let's talk about how to do benevolence and integrity. And when I'm training scientists and when I'm working with scientists, when I ask them these specific, like, well, given our context, what could we do to help foster people's perceptions that you guys are doing this research to advance the public good, we can have really good tactical conversations about what that looks like. It's a much better sort of cue to conversation. It really creates an opportunity for creativity around tactics, which I think has been really helpful. We can do that in terms of the word attitudes. People throw the word attitude around. I find that kind of vague. Let's talk about, what do you want people to believe in terms of what risks do you want people to believe? What benefits do you want people to believe? In the context of what behavior are we talking about? And so we can have this much more interesting conversation if we really push people to not throw around terms like trust or attitude, and we get down to the nitty-gritty, those core ingredients of, beliefs about behaviors, beliefs about people. And that gets to this, I've already mentioned this in ways. We have this, we call this we have the TOG model, which is tactics, objectives, goals, and we have the GOTOG model, which is goals, objective, tactics, objectives, goals, because it's really this sort of progression of strategy that we're trying to push. One of my fun projects is it's this project that's been on the back burner, but I have all like the PR textbooks and looking at how we talk about strategy across all the PR textbooks, and also how we talk about theory in all the PR textbooks. And I'll say those are almost, with a couple of exceptions, those are pretty bad too, that they talk about goals and objectives and strategy kind of haphazardly. We're not doing enough of this, taking from the social science and saying, well, audience-specific behavioral goals and cognitive and affective objectives. And then we can, at the front end and the back end of good communication. And so we're pushing this way of thinking about it. It's funny because it's really not, it's things we all kind of know. And I don't know, we're just trying, a lot of our work is about how do we get people to actually use this thing that all of us, underlying all of this research is like, there's all these communication researchers, but people aren't using our ideas. And so how do we get them to use our ideas? And so that's kind of where we got into this. And we're pushing scientists, we are at least pushing scientists to sort of think in terms of this, figure out your behavior. Now we can talk about your objectives from this sort of discrete list. And now we can talk about, once we've done that, once we have that first part of the strategy, we can get into talking about, well, what tactics might do that given our available assets. And so I'm going to stop there, and happy to chat about, curious what people think. And thanks for letting me share.
Thanks, John. That was wonderful. That wasn't I was expected at all, because it's so high level
Yeah.
of science communication. But I think you're hitting on some really important deficiencies we currently have in the practices of science communication. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to save them toward the end. And then I want to see if our audience members have any questions, comments they want to put forward. I'm also monitoring the chat. If you want to put your questions in the chat, that will be also be, and I'll relay those questions to John. So yeah, feel free to just raise your hand, or,
Brooke's got one there.
Yeah, we got one already, Brooke.
Hey, Brooke.
Hi, John. Good to see you. I was
delighted
to see this connection between science communication and public relations. That's not always seen a lot. So I want to push you a little bit on PR theory.
Yeah.
There's been a big movement away from peer management perspectives and towards public-centered perspectives. So strategy starts with understanding what publics want versus what your scientist wants.
Yep.
Could you speak a little bit about how that might be happening in science communication, or not happening, and why?
Can I ever? I was just at a conference with my conference, and I had a main stage debate with my advisor on this very question. He took the perspective of start with audience first. I took the perspective that I take, which is probably, of course, it's back and forth, right? If you go back to that idea of asset management, like one of our assets is like, well, what does our audience think? What do our audience need? If I go back to the goal setting process, part of that is about like, well, I start with my goal, but then I got to be ready to change my goal. I can't, like, if you have a goal and you're just like, well, I'm locked in, that's the only goal I care about, even though everybody else around me hates it, then that's dumb. You shouldn't do that. Wouldn't be appropriate or likely to be effective or anything good. And so there's this, but then I go back to there is an element of, when I think about scientists, when I think about most organizations, they exist for a reason. They have goals. And I think it's a bit funny to pretend it's weird to me. It's a bit problematic for me to ask a scientist, just go in the community and see what they want, and then do that. Like, that's just not, it sounds nice, and there's roles for that. And in fact, so there is a movement in the science communication space around like creating science shops and things where that do play that role of like, if to let questions bubble up from the community, which is absolutely important, which is people, they should we need institutions that enable that. But on the flip side of that, scientists, like the scientists that I tend to work with, they have, I should say, like almost should say like tentative audience specific behavioral goals or something, right? Like, but they have those goals. And so I think we start from our conversations with that. We go in, so we are doing this project now, and yeah, like we have one version, which is talking to the scientists about what they think they want to achieve. But at the same time, almost the same time, there's like conversations, getting to know the community about what kind of things are going to be appropriate. And that melding bit, that asset thing is, it goes back, yeah, there's like, we're never starting from zero. We're always starting from somewhere. There's rarely do we get to go in and start like strategy from a blank sheet. And so it's, I don't know. Yeah, I absolutely, yeah, I understand the perspective, but I do think we have to recognize that people have goals, and we can work from there.
Okay, we do have a bunch of other questions coming in. John, would you mind not sharing the
Oh yeah, of course.
screen so we can see more folks here?
More folks.
We got a full house here.
Nice.
There is a question that coming through the chat, and then I'll go to Anita, and then there's and then we'll address other questions coming in. Seimin is one of our graduate students, and she asked in the chat, in achieving the grand goal of science communication you mentioned, how do you envision the role of general publics who have a pseudo expertise level of scientific background or experience, such as citizen scientists? The question.
Yeah. So for me, the idea would be that the more specific you can be about your audience, your publics, if you want to use that language, the better, the more targeted you're going to be able to, and I don't like using the word targeted, but the more concrete, more specific you're going to be able to make your strategy. And so there may be scientists who have like these broad societal level, or, they want Americans in general, or people in the United States in general, to turn to science. And we can work around that. And then, which gets into the importance of collaboration. It gets into the importance of, but to me, the more interesting stuff is finding those places. And probably, and I guess I should say, it's not just it's more interesting. My suspicion is it's going to be more effective if, or hypothesis is it'll be more effective if we can think in terms of specific audiences that we're interested in and specific behaviors that we're interested in. Just trying to go broad, it's hard. There's too many choices at that point. You need to do strategy well. I mean, this is where, so I've been thinking a lot about this idea of a creative brief that people in advertising and PR use. And one of the interesting things about creative briefs, right, is that if people know these things, it's the thing that we give to the creatives at an ad or PR shop that has the insights in it that then people build campaigns around. And the key thing about that is it puts the creatives in a bit of a box. It gives them constraints. And so it's hard to do strategy without some constraints. And so, because otherwise you just have everything. And so I really do think there's something there's something really important about to do strategy, about forcing yourself to constrain yourselves by your opportunities and your resources and ultimately, yeah, all those things. So I don't like thinking it. I generally don't think at that. I try to avoid thinking it at that broader level. I don't know if that answers the question though. Sally, I think you're muted there.
All right, sorry, I'm muted. I think she was asking about your view about citizen scientists. What do you envision their role in science communication?
I mean, at first, that's a specific group. So for me, citizen science is a tactic that we use. It has certain purposes. Sometimes the tactic is, then you can think about that tactic as being, it's a tactic that we use, or a method. It's a thing we use to do better science, but it's also often a thing that people do as a communication activity as well. It's a tactic, so that means it has tactic. We could say technology. It means it has affordances. There's certain things that allow you to do, certain things that it doesn't allow you to do. It's great if your goal can be solved by, or if that tactic works for your goal, then absolutely. But it's one activity. It's one type of thing that we can do. It's a great one. I came out of Cornell. They have the the big bird ornithology lab there. Citizen science really comes out of there. Like, it's a great tactic for building some self-efficacy in scientists, giving, actually another thing. So I don't know if I put it in this slide deck, but one of the things we say is, like, when in doubt, give people a positive experience with science. Like, if you don't have a whole big grand strategy, that's probably okay too sometimes, but give people a positive experience. And I think a lot of citizen science things are just good experiences people have with science. Maybe good experience with scientists, which is also good. But it's, to me,
Right.
it's a tactic.
Yeah, we're going to Anita. Thank you so much for being very patient. Anita, go ahead.
Hi, Anita.
Hi, John. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. And I'm going to jump back a little bit to Brooke's question, because Brooke, I had a similar idea in terms of
Yep.
the relation theorizing. And I appreciated this idea of needing to acknowledge that scientists are in organizations that have goals, and to not do that is not taking a holistic perspective. But where's the point in ethics here in terms of those goals, and still thinking about, a lot of times, scientists are a part of organizations that have, systematically and historically marginalized certain communities. And, where is the ethics piece in terms of making sure their goals are not marginalizing or reifying systems of oppression?
Absolutely. And probably that's one of the hardest things that we had in writing the book was how to, it's the hardest thing to talk about strategy, right? Like, how do you talk about doing strategy ethically, reflexively, all those good things? And so we sort of, it's a tricky thing. And so one of the ways we think about is like, so one of the goals we have in this other, I think in a current survey is like, one of the goals could be like changing science so it's more reflective. Like, so we can have a goal, which is changing ourselves, and the changing ourselves is making us more diverse, more inclusive, more, and so equitable, more oriented towards justice. And so we can do, so it could be that I'm in an organization and I realize this about my organization, and I'm going to take an internal perspective. Like, all right, my goal isn't going to be to go out into the world and say we're benevolent. Because if you don't, I mean, so there's an ethical, if you're not doing research to serve the public good, you can't say that. I mean, just like that's just lying. And so it's just not, I mean, we're just not interested. I mean, in a way we're sort of take on as an assumption that you're lying is going to be bad at the front end, but that we also can use strategy to these same concepts to change our organization. It turns out that then our goal is, our audience might be our organizational leadership or our colleagues. And so we're using strategic concepts to get them to realize that, these behaviors are risky and non-beneficial and normatively wrong. And it's in our ability to change these behaviors. And so that's how we kind of think of it. Yeah.
One of the things I appreciated that you said that could be one of the ways to kind of think through this is the fact that the individual communicators have goals, and you are asking them in these moments of reflection, what are your goals? And maybe within this goal reflection exercise, think about, are you considering all the relevant stakeholders and publics when thinking about your own goals? And kind of having that moment of ethical reflection baked into the process with the scientist when really having and doing that hard work in terms of articulating their own goals. Because one of the things I appreciated about your approach is like, goals are hard, and it is hard for scientists to kind of do that self-reflection sometimes and go back to the self. So maybe that's a space where we can have these kind of ethical reflexivity aligning with other social scientific scholarly conversations currently.
I love that point. And I think we make this point sometimes. I don't know that we do it as well as we could or as systematically, but yeah. So one of our arguments is like, and this goes back to this idea of we're really interested right now in this role of the strategist, the person who could tell a scientist. We're really worried about, for example, a lot of science communication practitioners are junior and they're women and they're paid poorly and they're dependent on principal investigators. And so they're not in a position where they can say, that's a terrible idea. You can't say that, that's wrong. And so there's these, and so one of the things we're really interested in this of importance of having somebody who can tell. And I'm lucky in that I've got to work with a couple of communication practitioners who are viewed in these sort of like as colleagues rather than employees, and that they do get to have that role of like pushing back on PIs. And it's so important and yet so rare. And that the degree to which, that the fact that we're being explicit about what we're trying to achieve lets us be reflexive. So much of this stuff is hidden, and like I know there's conversations I have with scientists, and like you can like really push them, and they don't like it often. I'm like, well, no, but why are you doing that? They don't love it when I do that to them.
Yeah, I really appreciate those reflections, John. And I will just say that I just also really appreciated the slow communication piece. It connected to social judgment and these ideas of messages over time. So I really appreciated that articulation, and I really enjoyed your talk today.
Thank you so much. Very kind.
Dr. Seeger.
Hi, John. How are you?
Hey, good. How are you?
Good. Wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed. Took a lot of interesting notes here. I want to sort of expand on the theme that's been brought up by Brooke and by others. And I'm wondering how you account for the power inequities that inevitably occur in these circumstances. The scientist is in a power position, controls access to information, controls methodologies, and the audience is in typically a powerless or less powerful position. And I found this to be a dominant feature of many of the conversations that I have with community members. Trying to understand and negotiate that power difference is very challenging. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I know people know Kathy Kramer's work out of Wisconsin. She has a great qualitative book on like how Wisconsin scientists are perceived up in the north parts of. And to me, I'm always, whenever I get questions, I always think of that, folks. And I think of that here in Michigan too, just because I know how it's Michigan's an interesting state in that it's got different places and different things happening in different parts. So what do I think about that? So at the end of the day, we're trying to figure, so we have this grant right now, it's through the Strengthening American Infrastructure Program at NSF. And so we're trying to think about this infrastructure bit, and we're trying to think about coming out of this work we did with LTER, a couple of LTERs, where we're like, well, how do you get access? How do you give scientists access to a strategist who isn't a pushover, who has power, who isn't dependent on them? Like, what are the, it gets into this, it's not trust researchers, what I really want to do. It's like, how do I create organizations within or structures within our organizations that where there's communicators with power, or that can't be pushed over, that aren't on individual grants. So much of our funding for communicators, especially communicators who work on science, there's communicators at universities that work for the dean, work for the vice president research, of course. But they're mostly promoting the university, and maybe if promoting the research helps promote the university, they'll do that. But it's back end stuff. It's not real, like that front end, like what are we trying to accomplish stuff. And so so part of that reason, we're trying to identify places where those people do exist. So we're looking, often what that means is like an organization of like 50 to 100 scientists where there's shared goals and there's a mission, but you still need a leadership that supports it. And so we're trying to find, again, we got into this whole world of structure, which is not something that I thought I would be studying in science communication, but it is, because I think that's how we create, how we deal with that power bit. There's other elements of like making sure that grant funders put real money, don't allow things like $3,000 for an undergrad to do social media and call that communication, and like putting having review committees demand real budgets for communication, having potentially the questions of like, we know that communicators they need to be across a bunch of different projects. It's a structural, we're thinking at the level of structures now rather than individuals. I don't know, does that answer it?
I think that's very helpful. One of the things that we're doing with some of our work in the city of Detroit is to train the audience members. Mm-hmm. So it's not train the scientists to speak, it's train the audience members to be more effective communicators, as they raise their particular issues or concerns. And so it's in many ways, it's sort of flipping the power dynamics or trying to address those power dynamics.
I'm curious, are you focusing on like individual community members, or are you able to get into like groups of like building capacity within groups?
We're working on building capacity within established community groups. We're working specifically on flooding issues. Yeah. And this has been very important as these groups try to negotiate with other political actors about resources to mitigate flooding.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's perfect. Yeah, I think that's I'm trying to think what would that look like? I mean, I know we're doing a little bit of stuff in this one of these another grant we have for long-term ecological research sites where there's a bit of that where we're trying to understand the communities around it, and it's turning into a little bit of that, but probably not as structured as we should. We're still at the point of trying to figure out what groups there are. I mean, I think one of the scientists don't know which groups. They might need to. Yeah, it's interesting. I go back to my working for Environment Canada. One of the things we used to do was fund NGOs to go to things like a big conference, conference of the parties, big UN conferences, and we'd fund our own critics to come and criticize us because we knew that if we didn't, they couldn't go, and then everything would be worse. But yeah, no, it's a really important. It's an interesting. I don't know that I've integrated that into my thinking enough, but that's it. Thank you for making that.
Thank you.
All right, we're at the 1 o'clock mark. We're a little bit
yeah.
over time, actually. Well, I just want to thank John for this wonderful talk and learn so much about science communication that I didn't know before. So that's really awesome. If we had time, I would love to hear more from you about the difference between fast communication versus slow communication. I think
Yeah.
it's a really profound point you made during the presentation. So I'd love to follow up to have more conversations with you. But thank you all for coming today. It was a wonderful session. So you all have a great day.
And I can stick around if anybody needs to, if there's any pressing things there.
Oh, yeah. Anyone who wants to stick around, we can have more talk. Hopefully I'll see you all at our next virtual seminar.
Yeah, the fast versus slow thing's a funny thing.